I will now kick off the summit by introducing our first moderator, my colleague Isaiah Banach. Isaiah is counsel in Dentons Municipal Land Use Planning and Development Law Group, widely known and well respected among public officials and with the development industry. Isaiah is well suited to support clients through their most challenging development matters. I'm thrilled to have Isaiah as a valuable member of our Toronto Municipal Land Use Planning and Development Law Group. Over to you, Isaiah. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Kat, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to do an introduction to Mr. Andy Best and Ryan Andersoff. The two of them will be speaking about digital maturity, which I thought was a great phrase to summarize their ideas. We'll first hear from Andy online, followed by Ryan, then a few minutes to answer questions. Andy is a public data advisor for government clients on data strategy, data governance, and innovation programming. He has consulted for federal and provincial agencies, regional governments, and municipal associations. This includes a recent public appointment in 2021 as Special Advisor to the Ontario Data Authority, which you'll hear more about from Andy. Ryan, over here, is the founder and CEO of Think Digital, a consultancy focused on helping public sector organizations adapt and thrive in the era of digital disruption. Ryan has more than 2 decades of experience working with government and international organizations in Canada, the US, and Europe. He is the co-founder of the Canadian Digital Service, a startup organization within the federal government launched in 2017 with the mission of helping government design, prototype, and build better digital services. And if you want to hear more from Ryan, you can find him on his podcast, Let's Think Digital, which I was listening to this morning on my way in, Government in the Era of Chat GPT, and I was quite intrigued by that. So welcome, Andy and Ryan. We will start with Andy online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaiah, and to the whole Dentons crew for the invitation and offer to speak today. My name is Andy Best. I'm a public data advisor, and I'm here to speak to you about data governance and data strategy in the context of building resilient smart cities. Can I have the next slide, please? In the context of the, just to thank Clint for sharing those 10 megatrends and his comments, just to situate my talk very quickly in the themes to date that we've heard. In regards to the pace of change of technology and how it is affecting, we're going to focus in on the municipal sector here, but I'll touch briefly on federal, provincial. The theme here is how can public governance and infrastructure speed up and close up that gap, between how can it respond to that unceasing pace of change. So where I'll start you off is a very quick look at what I'm seeing across my client base over the last number of years. So many public entities have new data strategies or are working on developing them very soon. Can we go back one? Thank you. And the reason for that is that all public entities right now are grappling with a couple of things. The first is the need to manage at a more comprehensive and higher strategic level data as a public asset. So data holdings, within vendor systems, but also within government itself. These extensive data holdings, managing that as a public asset is a big new challenge. And the second is for the governance and management of the associated technology ecosystem. So put all those things together, I'm talking about the modernization of public institutions writ large, as well as digital infrastructure and public services, digital services. The public sector faces particular challenges from digital and data because data and its governance has a way of kind of stymieing us and stymieing action, preventing collective action, because it cuts across, in my opinion, our traditional public institutions, our traditional jurisdictional framework here in Canada, and our existing regulatory frameworks as well. Now, this happens on a number of issues. This is not comprehensive, but broadly speaking, government and the public sector is struggling with issues related to data ownership, commercialization, and management. infrastructure planning and policy, economic development, innovation, privacy, cybersecurity, civil rights. It's a long list. Most are working on it, but it's extremely difficult because of the overarching and comprehensive nature of these challenges. Can I have the slide, please? So zooming in at the municipal level now, they continue to experience massive pressure. And most of the folks in the room here who work in and around the municipal sector will know this. Massive pressure to modernize on all fronts, especially regarding digital and data. So I was speaking with a colleague yesterday who works in this space still, and he said, 5 years ago, it was as if we had a 5-pound weighted blanket on. This year now, it's like we have a 50-pound weighted blanket on when they're going about their day-to-day. In addition to that pressure to modernize on digital data, we're faced with the fact that when it comes to building out all of the physical things that are required for municipalities, be it roads or be it bridges or things with electrical components for the building code and other types of those types of regulatory systems come into play, cities are really good at that. We're really good at building the physical parts of municipalities. But when it comes to digital and data, municipal modernization increasingly requires more complex forms of digital infrastructure, which is far less simple. It's not, what our public institutions at the local level were really designed to build themselves. And it's also one where, given the structural fiscal constraints facing municipalities, it's extremely difficult to fund our way out of this at this point. The analogy that I'll provide there is we have a very strong understanding in Canada nationally of, and in Ontario as well, of the physical infrastructure gap is what it's called. So how much are we underfunding the full life cycle? Asset management is the discipline there. But how much are we currently underfunding the full life cycle of our infrastructure in order to be able to replace it one day sustainably? So we know that number nationally. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities puts out a report every year looking at a variety of different physical infrastructure systems and services and what the nature of that gap is. We have no understanding on the digital infrastructure side of what that gap is. It's barely a concept, let alone something that we have a dollar figure on, and that is critical to sparking action, is being able to measure that. In addition, as municipalities are trying to modernize, they're hitting up against some of the realities of computer science, which is that those things are designed, usually technology products and companies, and what they're looking for, they're designed at scale and to scale. But municipalities are having to all carve their own path. And there is a vacuum in terms of higher level comprehensive management of the municipal sector as a whole in regards to digital and data modernization. So as a macro level modernization model, if you say, how can we modernize, the whole municipal sector at once, or at least, chunks of it, it's not effective, or it's less effective to do everything individually in each municipality. In addition, broadly speaking, public governance is a challenge over new and complex forms of technology in the municipal sector. They're so concerned, justifiably preoccupied with the day-to-day business of running a municipality, which is very comprehensive, that these new kind of opaque types of projects can occasionally come in and hit us between the eyes. So one example of all of those things was the recent, a couple years ago now, I suppose, but Sidewalk Labs and Quayside project in Toronto. I'm not going to summarize that here because there's books and now there's a stage play about it. So there's plenty of places to get information about the nature of that project. But broadly speaking, setting aside the land implications of it and the sustainable development aspects, there was also a huge digital infrastructure subcomponent of that, which wasn't as played out or as developed. And we had a really, at the core of that discussion was who's going to build and set the rules, for the underlying infrastructure that will sustain future public services. So there was a struggle inside of that project on the digital infrastructure front for control over public governance in that area. Can I have the next slide, please? So the question is then, how then do we responsibly modernize the municipal sector at scale? And what is the link to data governance and data strategies in the smart city context? So in my opinion, the economic argument behind shovels in the ground, that term, it's a stimulus term. It means we're starting projects. It means we've funded infrastructure. It means we're creating jobs. It's going to generate new tax receipts. And inside of that infrastructure, new economic activity is going to happen on top of that. And it's a virtuous cycle that you can fund more infrastructure and, et cetera. So that's kind of one of the most commonly accepted arguments in our political system. We see every national government have their own version of hey, everyone, we're building and funding public infrastructure. And we understand how good that is. My argument is that exact same model can apply to digital and data modernization. So when we build the road, we know how to do it safely and in the public interest with common approaches to infrastructure, enforcement, funding, standards, etc. I think that we can do the exact same thing for digital infrastructure modernization under a model called, pretty simply, digital public infrastructure. So instead of physical infrastructure stimulus, talking about digital infrastructure stimulus, geared to have the same types of impact as traditional shovels in the ground. And so digital public infrastructure combines infrastructure, public policy, standards, funding, traditional infrastructure stimulus, and applies it to government modernization. And this allows for digital shovels in the ground projects to be delivered inside of this model. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm describing a theoretical world here, but government has taken an exploratory first look at this a few years ago. So this is a headline from the Globe and Mail. Pardon me, I forgot to credit them there. Information's out of date. You see the little notice there. This was an exploratory public initiative in 2021. And to be clear, no actual institution or programming exists at this time. There's a public consultation page that you can look into what it was and the types of issues that were being looked at. But just a very quick high level, those consultations were focusing on helping government develop new data stewardship models, new data governance and standards, as well as early use cases to become digital shovels in the ground projects. So that's from 2021, out of date, as I said, and no actual institution exists. However, there has been an exploratory look taken at the model. Can I have the slide, please? So the goal of our panel is building on the very thoughtful themes that were shared off the top by our hosts. Our panel goal is to understand the critical role of data governance and public infrastructure in building resilient and forward-thinking smart cities. So my argument today is that the solution to modernizing municipalities at scale is the digital public infrastructure model, implemented as provincial data governance, data standards, infrastructure, and stimulus over the coming decades. You can wrap this up. Digital public infrastructure is one term you could use. You could use digital public works, building on again the idea of physical public works, things that we build in the public interest with strong public regulation and governance. Clint was referring to this, parts of this as social infrastructure as well. So that's part of what this concept is trying to encompass, the totality of what's required, not just buying a new technology, but elevating our systemic levels of governance and stewardship over data, over digital systems, and over, the increasingly intangible and hard to grasp forms of digital infrastructure that are underpinning public services. Can I have the slide, please? So short presentation today. Super grateful to everybody for listening and hearing me out on the digital public infrastructure model. The very short story is that I think the opportunity is to adapt shovels in the ground to digital and data modernization in municipalities. This, in terms of the social infrastructure side, this is also a delivery layer for public policy and regulatory decisions. As I said, when we build a road, the speed limit rules come with it, as do the enforcement, as do what's in a safe asphalt mix, right? So we can apply, not in terms of complexity, it's more complex on the digital side versus asphalt, but we can apply the concept to the modernization model. This is not happening yesterday. This is a complex 25-year modernization vision. And, I'm describing kind of a holistic approach here that requires many different inputs. One specifically that I'll flag is, I think, any approach to this has to be accompanied by digital stimulus over multiple use cases that also collectively grow common infrastructure layers that municipalities just can't practically build themselves, each to their own. A few examples: identity, data exchange. Many leaders in the municipal space, do have progress on those issues and do have, effective data cooperatives and other forms of higher level data management. But for the most part, right now, most municipalities are doing the very hard work of digital and data modernization in isolation, with those pockets of high capacity, greater funding, and early adopters leading. But, in my opinion, under the current model, we're leaving a significant amount of potential collective benefits on the table. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, and welcome everybody. Great to be with you. Thanks, Isaiah, for the introduction, and Andy for your remarks. I want to pick up on some of the themes Andy was talking about just now around data infrastructure and kind of broaden that a little bit, or maybe I could say the flip side of the coin, to think about digital maturity for municipalities as I think one of the other preconditions for that foundation for smart cities. And I want to take just a few minutes and give you a little bit of context around what this term digital means, because I think there can be a lot of different definitions for what we mean by digital when we say it, and give you a little bit of a sneak peek around some of the work that we're doing at a municipal level here actually in the GTA, thinking about what this looks like in practice. So I'm going to start with a definition, and this is a definition of digital that I like to use. It comes from a gentleman named Tom Loosemore, who was one of the co-founders of the Government Digital Service in the UK. And he talks about this kind of two-sided equation for digital. So on the one hand, it's about the culture, practices, processes, and technologies of the internet era. Importantly, not just technology, but these ways of working that go part and parcel with, your modern concept of how an organization might work. If you think about your kind of concept of a Silicon Valley startup, that might be what we mean in terms of those culture and practices and processes. Other side of it is this notion of raised expectations and the reality that the citizens and employees that municipal governments or governments at all levels are serving and that work within their organizations live in an Amazon and Netflix and Google world, and their expectation of what kind of modern digital service delivery looks like is being shaped by their experiences in the broader private sector. And as we have seen, governments have struggled to keep pace with that. So I find this to be a useful framing for what we mean by digital. When we kind of take this notion of digital and apply it to the public sector here in Canada, I think there's been three distinct phases of evolution over the last couple of decades. So the first was back in the mid-1990s, early 2000s. This was kind of the early days of the World Wide Web as we know it now. And people were calling this e-government globally. In Canada, people were using the term government online. This was really about governments for the first time taking information and services and putting them onto the web. And worth noting, Canada was widely seen as a world leader at this time. We would often be in the top 3 worldwide when there'd be rankings around e-government. We then, in mid-2000s to mid-2010s, went into this next phase of what people were calling Government 2.0. And this was really about government institutions adapting to social media and a much more horizontal way of collaborating, communicating, and citizens organizing in different types of ways. Also very much tied up with the open government movement, and particularly at the municipal level, saw a lot happening around open data and sharing data more broadly within society. And then in the last 5 to 10 years, I think we have now moved into this new phase of what people are calling digital government, which is at a more holistic level, looking at how we take advantage of new digital technologies and data and actually rethink how government works at a deeper level. Similar to digital, there's a lot of different definitions of what digital government can mean. This is one from the OECD that I like to share, and two things I would highlight from it. One is this notion that digital government is often talking about a modernization strategy. So it's not just about digital service delivery, that's part of it, but it's actually about how do we take advantage of technology to modernize the organization at a deeper level. And then the second is this idea of an ecosystem approach, that often in the digital government era, it's not government doing it by itself, but it's working with other players and other actors in a much more holistic type of way. Perhaps put even more simply, this is a tweet quote I always like to share from Jennifer Polka, who was the founder of Code for America, a big civic tech organization down in the United States. On this notion that just modernizing your technology isn't going to get you very far, and in fact may be counterproductive, that you have to actually change the policies and processes of your organization. I'll note she has a great new book out called Recoding America, focused on the American lens on this, but some great lessons that I think are equally applicable north of the border for anybody who might be interested in this. So this question of how do we modernize our organizations really is part and parcel with digital maturity. So I wanted to give you just a little sneak peek at some work that we are doing right now to actually think about how to measure digital maturity, specifically at a municipal level. We've been partnering with York Region here in the GTA, and they have been going through, I think, an impressive digital modernization journey in their organization, but they wanted to be able to answer the question, how are we doing, right? And what is our baseline, and what does an ideal state look like for the organization to go off over time? As Andy said, some of these things can be multi-decade efforts to change the organizations, and people often need to have that roadmap as they go along. So we've been working with them over the last year to actually co-create a digital maturity model, which we are just in the process, actually, as we speak, of doing our first implementation of, to be able to answer those questions. And really this is meant to be a benchmark and be able to help them to set priorities in the short to longer term as they go through this. And our hope is this will be something that organizations can do on a bit of a regular basis. So this is kind of the core of our digital maturity model that we've developed, and kind of call it the hexagon model for obvious reasons. And it has two essential halves to it. The top half comprises the 10 digital standards, and this is actually digital standards that the federal government has put in place. But York Region, in their case, had actually adopted the 10 digital standards from the federal government. So it made a lot of sense to use that as one of the framing methods. And then the bottom are a set of what we call foundational enablers. And this gets into kind of more of the machinery of how a government organization works and looking at how those have adapted for the modern era. And so we've got these kind of 6 categories of agile, user-centered, open, and then governance, people, and operations, and then indicators underneath all of that, 18 kind of subcategories in total. And so for us, when we think about digital maturity for an organization, this is the framing we're really using. And I think, importantly, you'll note on this that a lot of this is not so much about technology, right? A lot of this is about how the organization works and really trying to get into the mindsets of how government works in the digital era. So our approach to this is we're taking 3 different types of indicators we use to score this. We're using document and data reviews to be able to get a sense of what the organizational perspective is vis-a-vis their rules in place on these areas. We're doing an employee survey to get the employee view on some of these questions. And then we do a workshop component to understand management practices and how they combine to this. And all of this leads to us having essentially what we're kind of looking at as a 5-point maturity model to look at across these different indicators and across these different categories where organizations are sitting on that spectrum. So it's been exciting work to kind of dive into this, and we're hoping after this initial Pathfinder project with York to be able to do this more broadly. But importantly, as I note in this, digital in this context is about much more than IT tools. We really are looking at the culture and processes and practices of the organization. And technology is an important part of it. They have to have kind of a modern tech stack to be able to be successful. But this notion that we think to be successful in the digital era, and in the context of this summit, if municipalities are going to be able to take advantage of the promise of smart cities, they have to change the way that they work. And so it requires this deeper modernization to be able to happen. And I think a deeper mindset change in terms of how people are approaching some of these problems. So to close this off, I wanted to just share some thoughts on what I kind of see as the theory of change behind this, particularly in public sector organizations. And I'm going to introduce you to what I call my Pac-Man model for digital change. So you probably all have heard the old adage that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I think that is 100% true. You can have the greatest digital strategy in your organization. You can have your greatest smart city strategy for your municipal government. But if you don't have a culture in the organization that supports it, it's not going to get you very far. But I argue that there are two bigger fish in the sea, and that incentives eat culture and structures eat everything else. And what I mean by that is, incentives are how people are rewarded in the organization, right? What gets them promoted? What gets them disciplined? What gets measured? What's in people's performance agreements? Those are the things that actually end up changing the culture over time and stretching it and shaping it. And then on structures, this is really about how decisions are made. Who gets to say yes and no to things? What are those gating and governance processes? What are the policies and regulations and laws that are in place that have to be followed or constrict the way that they work? And so I would argue, when we kind of look broadly at governments over the last decade or two, when we think about this notion of their digital evolution and digital maturity, a lot of work has happened on the strategy side. There's been a lot of talk about the culture side, but I would argue very little has been done around changing incentives and structures within their organizations. And so I kind of leave to you, as we open up for discussion, I think the real challenge, if we kind of think about how do we move public sector organizations into the modern era and enable them to be able to take on things like smart cities, is we're going to have to really start thinking about the structures and incentives in these organizations, how to be able to shift them. And that, to me, is the core part of the equation to think about digital maturity.